Hi, my name is Ian Burkak, and today I will be sharing with you guys my machine learning project, which is a surface analysis on tennis courts. So, the motivation behind this is that in the tennis world, we're approaching the end of the Big Three era, which is basically an era over the last 2 decades that have been dominated by these three players. So, to start with Roger Federer, um, he was, until very recently, he was considered to be the greatest player of all time, and he won 20 Grand Slams, which was a record at the time. And by the way, a Grand Slam is one of the four major tournaments, which is Wimbledon, the French Open, Australian Open, and the US Open. And he set a record at Wimbledon for winning eight of them. He retired last year. Then we have Rafael Nadal, who upped Federer's record to 22 Grand Slams, including 15 at the French Open, which is the record for the most Grand Slam victories at one tournament. And he is expected to retire next year, which is where I got this idea from, because at that time he had announced that he was going to be done after next year. And then we have Novak Djokovic, who now people consider to be the greatest of all time, who upped Nadal's record to 24 Grand Slams, which includes 10 at the Australian Open. He's 36 years old right now, and he, because of that, he is approaching that retirement age very soon, but he's still going strong. So, just how dominant were these three? They won 66 out of the 80 Grand Slams over the last 2 decades, which is roughly 83% of all Grand Slams. They also held the number one ranking for around 909 weeks, which is equivalent to 17 out of 20 years, which is, other than probably the Messi Ronaldo era in soccer, like this is probably the most dominant, like three people at a sport like ever. And what was very interesting about these three together is that they each excelled at a particular surface. So for Federer, it was the grass court, as he set a record for the most Wimbledon victories ever with eight. Nadal, as the king of clay, French Open, won 15 clay court, French Opens on the clay court. And then you have Djokovic, who excelled primarily on the hard court. And what's interesting about these three surfaces is that they each have different properties to the tennis ball. So, for instance, the grass court plays at the fastest speed, but the ball doesn't bounce very high. In contrast, the clay court is considered to be the slowest surface on the tour, but the ball does bounce the highest, and then the hard court is like essentially in the middle of these two. And the motivations for this project are to analyze if a particular surface has distinguishable advantages over others. So we're going to analyze what statistics, what shots are considered to be the most important on a given surface. We're going to understand which strategies and playing styles are favored based off of a surface. So maybe there's a surface that has a tendency to favor more consistent players, or a tendency that where a serve is considered to be more advantageous or more aggression. And we're going to try to match a play style to an optimal surface at the end. And who potentially benefits? Tennis players could use this to understand how different surfaces impact the game and how to adjust to a surface. Coaches can develop strategies for surface types and prepare players for what to expect. And the fans could also benefit from this as well if they want to truly understand and love the game of tennis and try to see and predict who could be more successful on a given surface based on a playing style. So the data was obtained from Ultimate Tennis Statistics, which was really nice because this was one of the only data tables that was able to break down like statistics such as aces and winners by their surface. But the difficulty with this data set is that each column that we saw here for each surface was printed as one. So the bulk of the data cleaning actually was trying to merge 36 data tables together into one massive data table that we see down here. And we also had to build a classifier by surface. So the classifiers that we're trying to classify are going to be clay, grass, and hard. And for some of the procedures that we used in supervised learning and unsupervised learning, we actually split this data table into two, mainly the serving table and a rallying table. So the serving table is basically all the serving statistics are in the table, and all the rallying statistics, so like when they hit the ball back and forth, were put into another table, and to simplify analysis and understand the impact of the serve and the ground strokes. We also used an API to delve for rankings and points. However, I actually ended up not using it at all in this analysis. primarily because like those rankings and that point system is very heavily influenced by how much someone plays as opposed to like whether they actually win. And I just personally believe that trying to like as like for the predictive stuff that using matches like the matches or victories was a lot more accurate, would be a lot better to use than a point system which values more playing more as opposed to like actually winning. Um, so we started with an unsupervised methods like clustering. And I think the main takeaway from the clustering analysis is that we saw a linkage between the clay and the grass courts. So what we see here for clay and grass is that they were actually put in the same two clusters, cluster 5 and cluster 2 in this example, while in the hard court, it was scattered all over the place. So this essentially said that there was a link between the clay and the grass surface, while the hard court is kind of its own entity. So, and then we took this a step further for unsupervised methods with association rule mining, where we split the serving and rallying data sets, and we performed association rule mining on both of those data sets to see if there's a link between a certain statistic and a surface. So, and even in order to prepare that, we had to, the data sets were discretized, and they're discretized into low, average, and, or normal in this case, low, normal, and high. And they were discretized based off of like what were the cutoffs at like what were the cutoffs from like the lower third to the upper third. And then what we saw for the serving data set that all rules had the word normal in it, which means that you can't have a bad serve. Like it has to be good at like your serve has to be like good enough. Um, and the hard court produced the most rules, followed by clay, and then grass only had one. So this could indicate that the hard court is the most important surface for a serve, followed by clay and grass too. And then the routing data set, we saw that the hard court was associated with forced and unforced errors at a very high rate, um, which could indicate that the hard court could favor more aggressive players. And the clay and the grass emphasized percentages mostly. So that could result in those two being more consistent surfaces as opposed to aggressive. And it was notable also that the number of winners and aces, so like a shot that like a serve or a forehand that like nobody that the opponent doesn't touch, did not have any notable rules. So maybe consistency was valued higher than aggression. And then for the decision trees, since we saw that the serving data set had more associations and arm than the rallying data set, we did a decision tree on the surface. So with this, this was the optimal decision tree right here with an accuracy of 77%, which was very good. And we saw here that for the clay court, the clay courts valued a first serve return percentage that was very high and double faults that were very low. So this could further back up the fact that the clay could be a more consistent surface. Hard court was associated with in the decision tree. The hard court had a high rate of double faults, high rate of first serve win percentage. So that could back up the assertion that the hard court is actually a more aggressive surface that like benefits more aggressive players. And then the grass court was just kind of weird in this one in the sense that like it was just kind of what was left over between the clay and the hard, but it was too early in the analysis to really decide like if the grass court had actually any meaning to it. We also ran the serving data set on naive bays as well. And the accuracy for that was it was less than 50%. I think it was 47. Yeah, was not nearly as effective as the decision trees. So then for the hitting data set, we actually ended up using support vector machines to see if we could classify a surface as hard or not hard. And it was very clear that there was a distinguishable difference between the hard court surface and a clay or a grass surface. Although at this point, this is when I started to suspect that this was due to the length of the season. Because on the tour per year, hard courts generally make up the vast majority of the season. The clay courts really only get 2 months of the year, and grass courts get even less time. So that's one. So hard courts consist of over 50% of the season. So the data could be heavily skewed towards the hard court, which is which made me realize that maybe we had to look into linear regression and see if we could break it down by surface to determine what the most important variables were. So we broke it down to a linear regression. So on the left side is the serving statistics, and the right side is the rallying statistics. So we started with six models that could see that was, and the whole point of this was to see what variables were considered important. Um, for the rallying table, I think what was interesting to note is that there was very few significant variables in this. Clay and grass had none, and hard court, the unforced errors were at like the 95 significance, and that was it. So this says that the rallying statistics have no effect on like winning matches on a particular surface. On the serving data set, we saw that the double faults and the second serve win percentage was considered to be significant across all three surfaces, although some things to distinguish that are a little bit different. Clay court values the first serve win percentage, and the aces and the first serve percentage were preferred on the or significant on a hard court, which would further back up the statistic that aggression that you can be more aggressive on a hard court, yet the clay court is a more consistent surface, and the grass court had nothing and like nothing significant. So that could imply that that's more of a wild card surface. And when we fit the full model, aces were important, unforced errors were important, first return percentage statistics were important. So across all the surfaces, it became evident that the serve was very more important than the forehand, backhand, ground strokes, and returning the serve was also very important. So to conclude that for all surfaces, it became evident from the linear regression and how the better results that we produced from the serving data set that the serve is the most important shot in tennis. We also saw from the linear regression that the rallying data did not have an effect at all on a winning on a particular surface. So the serve is the most important. There is like when someone serves like on a game when somebody serves, I think it is the server usually has an advantage because they do start the point. So that is the one shot they are in control of when they serve. So yeah, we see also here that the clay court does favor consistency and accuracy. It didn't have the aggressive variables that the hard court had, but it had a lot more than the grass court had. And this is favorable for like a counterpuncher, which a counterpuncher is a player that is like a consistent player. The hard court we saw allowed for a more aggressive play style, where as aces were considered significant from the linear regression, unforced errors and forced errors were also significant. Were also high lift rule in the association rule mining. So the hard court does favor more aggressive play styles. And since the grass court wasn't really significant at all, it's kind of a wild card. It's kind of a wild card court, which could be why they don't play as much on the tour. So that could fade. So maybe that play style could favor somebody that's good at a little bit of everything, that's very adaptable, or somebody with a big serve and can finish points quickly, like at the net. So, and then I think overall for this project, where I would take the next steps is I would see if I could find a way to like properly reflect the length of the season of the hard court, glass court, clay court. See if I can like make those even. Standardizing the data doesn't really do that because it would still make the hard court variable like much more significant than a grass or a clay. Maybe it could be like a division by 6 or multiplying the clay or the grass by like the same rate as the hard court. But yeah, maybe we can do a pickleball analysis too, like when we have enough data on that, because that's getting huge as well. I'd like to see if there's any connections with pickleball and tennis as well. But yeah, besides that, that's all I got to say. So thank you so much for